continuing on chapter 4 lectures, what we're going to be looking at now is testing of the muscular strength systems. So, testing muscular strength. What we use is two methods. We have a direct or an indirect method of testing clients' maximal contractile abilities. So, muscular strength or muscle activation or resistance training is the body's ability to produce a contraction or produce force against resistance. There is a high injury risk. Warm-ups are essential, and specific technique instruction must be followed at all times. This is one of the reasons why a lot of my 1RM testing isn't performed at the very beginning of a program for a client who has little to no experience in weight training. If I have a client who's little to no experience in weight training or an exercise at all, then what I will generally look at doing is developing what we call a foundation phase, which has got very, very light weights, high rep, a greater predominance of cardiovascular training to allow the body time to adapt. Now, during this foundation phase, it allows me to teach client movement patterns and effective technique for performing exercises. Once this technique has been developed, then I can start looking at really testing a 1RM or what we call a predictive 1 repetition max for the client without the risk of injury. So the high injury risk is directly related to technique, poor technique, adherence, and a poor warm-up. So as a trainer, you must ensure that firstly your client is effectively warmed up and the muscles are ready to be used, and secondly that their technique is immaculate to perform the exercise that I need to test. If it is not, then I need to give an adequate length of time to develop this technique. Now, strength tests, we have a number of strength tests available to us. In the book, we have a number that we look at, one of which is our 7-stage sit-up. Now, our 7-stage sit-up is an assessment of the abdominal strength. We stop on failure. Now, with any of these tests, as a trainer, it is essential that we follow the testing protocols exactly. If there's any breaking or change of form of this testing, then I must end the test. We do not allow for any small variations or small movements. It tests the exact muscle. Purely because how we apply resistance training and test resistance training to a client is we test it based on resistance against the movements of those muscles. If the movement isn't performed, then that muscle isn't being used as a result, and the test becomes void. So I must ensure that the movement of the muscle is performed exactly to the test to ensure the validity of the test. The second technique forms, the test must end immediately because it means the client is recruiting alternate muscles and thus I'm getting a bad reading. Now, this 7-stage sit-up is an essential strength test before performing any form of resistance training program. The heavier the resistance training program, the greater requirement of this 7-stage sit-up. The reason being is the 7-stage sit-up tests the abdominal strength. What it is going to tell me is that it's going to tell me the abdominals and the abs' ability to generate high amounts of force rapidly, instantaneously, to prevent injury to the lower back. Now, my abdominal muscles make up part of the core. Now, our core muscles are made up of the abdominals to the front and the back stabilizers, of which there are 3 on the back, 4 to the front, and my hip stabilizers, namely transverse abdominis. Now, what this 7-stage sit-up does is it tests the strength of these muscles, which means that if I'm performing any heavyweight exercise, compound in nature, whether it be a squat, a lunge, a deadlift, a chest press, whatever it may be, what it tells me is if there's a sudden, rapid break in form, whether the client fatigues, and as a result there's an excessive amount of force placed through the lower back, the abdominals will be strong enough to recruit quickly enough to lock the lumbar spine, support the vertebrae and prevent injury. If I am weak in the 7-stage sit-up, then it may mean that I will have to remove certain heavy compound exercises before the abdominal strength is developed, or it could predispose my client to lower back injuries, or to an unforeseen lower back injury that I wouldn't have otherwise picked up on. So when performing any form of heavyweight training, strength training, especially in the lower limbs, the 7-stage sit-up is invaluable. Now, what we look at is 1 repetition max. Now, 1 repetition max exercise is designed to give me the maximal force capacity and capabilities of the muscle. They're indications of maximal force production. They determine the starting intensities of any program. Now, when we go into the anatomy, we will talk a bit more about muscle recruitment, muscle utilization, and isolation. Now, at this stage, we just talk about the fact there are 3 distinct areas of muscle recruitment. They're what we call aerobic and anaerobic muscle fibers, of which there are 3. There is what we call type 1 muscle fibers, which are an aerobic muscle, which use oxygen to produce energy. And we have type 2A and type 2B muscle fibers, which are what we class as anaerobic in nature and generate high force potentials. Now, my intensities, my 1 repetition max will give me the ability to identify at what intensity I should have my client lifting weights to isolate each one of these subgroups. So if my goal is for stabilization and endurance, which we've talked about earlier, then I need a percentage of 1 repetition max to work the type 1s. If my goal is more from a fuel utilization or a toning point of view, then I need to use a percentage of the 1 repetition max to isolate the type 2As. And if it is a strength and power, more sports performance specific or whatnot, then I need a specific percentage of 1 repetition max to isolate the type 2B muscle fibers. Without 1RM testing, I have no ability to identify muscle fiber recruitment, and as a result, I'm merely guessing and hoping for the best that my weight training achieves the goals that I'm looking to do. Best case scenario, it just prolongs the length of time of a program. Worst case scenario, the intensities can be too great for the muscle fibers used and thus cause injury. So it helps to determine these starting intensities as discussed. It's determined by trial and error, and it is of a sub-maximal nature. We do not use max and 1RM testing as a trainer on general population because the risk of injury is just too great. It will cause maximal isolation and recruitment of a muscle. If the weight is wrong, I can cause absolute failure and thus put the soft tissue as well as the structural components of the joints at risk. So several advantages to this submax loading as a result. It is less unnerving and it is far safer and quicker. Now, testing of the muscular endurance system. It is specific to muscle group. Yeah, many tests. We have many tests. As long as I can identify a muscle and identify its movement, then I can test it. Now, we test endurance in a number of ways. Either repetitions per minute or timed hold. So, on that mentality, we have 2 categories of which weight training and endurance testing comes into. Our first is static tests. Now these are performed by holding the body position, and the endurance test is done by timing. So we get a client into a certain position and we get them to hold this position for longer periods of time, pretty much as long as they can. Okay? Now this is used for clients who have to assume certain positions for longer periods of time. Examples are testing the muscular endurance of the upper body, particularly the stabilizers in the back and the scapular stabilizers for secretaries. Because they have to assume seated positions for long periods of time hunched over computers, it is fatiguing of the back stabilizers that allow the shoulders to roll forward, putting compression on the cervical spine and the neck and thus causing pain, discomfort and possible headaches. So we will test the muscular endurance of these stabilizers. Yeah. Now these stabilizers are based on muscles that are required to hold fixed positions for long periods of time. Now our dynamic tests are repeated movements to a range of motion and assessed by counting number of reps. So my static is based on holding positions for as long as possible, whereas my dynamic tests are based on setting a time limit of, we'll say, a minute, and getting my client to perform as many repetitions to perfect form and technique within that minute. And my dynamic tests are more prominent in my testing for clients, as pretty much everything we do is dynamic. It's movement orientated, which means as a result, I must look at these. As a result, I must look at these dynamic tests. Now, there are certain areas within the body as to which will require more static and more dynamic. as we discussed earlier on in previous lectures, we have two distinct types of resistance training. We have resistance training for that agonist to antagonist relationship, and we have resistance training for the stabilizers. Now, resistance training for the stabilizers is based more on static testing, as the stabilizer muscles are required to maintain a constant contraction to stabilize a joint while the joint moves. Whereas my dynamic tests are required more towards a agonist to antagonist relationship, as these are muscles that are going to bring about the movements of the joints. So when looking at a client, I need to determine which is more prominent. When we go through programming, we will discuss the differences, but based on what we call corrective exercise programming, where I isolate stabilizers, my testing will be more based on a static test. Whereas when everyday Joe Blogs off the street, general population off the street, with no problems, no worries, or no conditions, then generally an agonist to antagonist ratio is what I look to test. As a result, I will use more dynamic or movement-orientated tests. Now, examples of dynamic tests include push-ups, which will test the strength of the endurance of the triceps, the shoulders, and the chest muscles, or abdominal crunches, which test the endurance of the trunk and the hip flexors. So in testing flexibility, it is the body's ability of the joints to move through a full range of motion. Now, regular flexibility work will help to delay decreases with age. Structure of the joint will determine the plane of motion in which we work in, and it's measured directly in terms of degree of movement. Now, these movements and testing of flexibility will give me an indication as to efficiency of the client. Flexibility is directly responsible for force production in the body. Greater the flexibility, the greater the force efficiency of the muscle, and thus the more efficient every movement occurs. The less flexible a client is, the less efficient they are producing force, and thus the less efficient all of their movement patterns are. Less efficiency or poor efficiency of movement pattern is a direct indicator or a direct risk of injury to the joints. So if we do identify a client who has poor flexibility, we identify a risk factor to joint structures. As a result, we must focus on increasing range of motion and flexibility first before applying any form of heavyweight training, which is very force specific. So it's indirectly measured in terms of a sit and reach, in terms of the centimeters of which they can achieve. So common tests for flexibilities include the sit and reach test, which assesses the flexibility of the hips, lower back. Check for problems and pain in these areas, and avoid any form of jerking or sudden movements to ensure validity of the test. Arm over, arm under tests, which assess bilateral upper extremity flexibilities for the client. So when we look at testing body composition, chances are the composition indicates successful in altering lean versus fat mass. When we talk about body composition, we talk about, I want to tone up, I want to lose weight, things like this. It's altering the percentage of lean muscle or lean tissue, which is predominantly muscular or skeletal muscle from a trainer's point of view, and fat mass or adipose tissue. Now, the four common methods of body mass index, BMI, they are waist to hip ratios, skin fold measurements, and bioelectrical impedance. Now my body mass index is based on height and weight. Screening for overweight, obese, and underweight are normal, and they tend to overestimate fat in athletes and underestimate larger muscle, or those with larger muscle builds. It'll help to underestimate body fat in individuals who are older, who have lost muscle mass. Now, BMI is what we consider as a population study. Okay? What we mean by that is the greater the data put into it, the more accurate the result is. BMI is not an accurate measurement for an individual client. For these reasons, it will overestimate the fat in athletes or those in a higher muscle content, and it will underestimate fat in those who are older or who have lost muscle mass, purely because it is based on height and weight. Unfortunately, weight is not valid because we don't know exactly what we're measuring. So, as we said, BMI is more based on the populative data as opposed to an individual client, so it's not necessarily recommended as a test to be used independent on itself. Now, waist to hip ratio is not a measure of lean or fat mass. Waist to hip ratio indicates fat deposits in the body, and research shows there's a large amount of storage in the upper body as opposed to the lower, predisposes clients to certain chronic diseases, such as coronary heart disease, coronary vascular disease, potential for type 2 diabetes based on hereditary factors. Now, what we look at is males in excess of 0.94 and females in excess of 0.84 are at greater risk. Now, with this waist to hip, similar to BMI, it is not normally used in individual cases as an independent test. However, we can use BMI and waist to hip together as a compare and contrast. If I have a BMI that's indicating a high level of risk of obesity with a waist to hip ratio in normal or in good, then one cancels out the other test. However, if I have a BMI that indicates obesity and risk, as well as a higher than average, higher than normal waist to hip ratio, then it can be an indicator of potential risk factors to the client for these lifestyle diseases such as coronary vascular disease and so forth. Now, other situations where we may use waist to hip and BMI is in cases of clients who are exceptionally uncomfortable with other tests such as skin folds, or younger people such as adolescents and teenagers, due to the risk of developing of psychological conditions and eating disorders where we put too great of an emphasis on things like skin fold measurements and diet and so forth. So it can give me an indication as to where they stand without making them feel too self-conscious about their bodies. Now, these skin fold measurements, precision depends on skill. This you must practice. There's no way around it. The more proficient you become at doing skin folds, the better the results, the better the readings, the more valid the reasons become. Now, measurements are made by measuring the subcutaneous fat of a client. Yeah, the more overweight, the harder it is to measure. Yeah, and duplicate readings are needed. So again, the more overweight the client, the harder the reading. So this may again be another situation where I use BMI and waist to hip together. I must not use them independent, but I use them together to give me an indication as to risk factors. Yeah. Now, these skin fold readings we take in 4 positions in the upper body. Now, precision is key. The quicker I do it, the more precise I am, the better it is for my client, the more comfortable my client feels. And the last thing we look at is bioelectrical impedance. It's an estimation of total body water. It's useful for analysis of both healthy and those with chronic conditions. However, it is affected by body positioning, hydration status and dehydration, consumption of food and beverages, ambient air temperatures, skin temperatures, and recent physical activity. Now, it's these problems that pretty much lead me away from using them. It is a valid, as long as I can control all of these variables, it is a valid test, but as I said, there is a lot that can go wrong, so it's generally not used as much.